Economists say South Africa's economy is likely in a technical recession. This comes as intensified power cuts and heightened uncertainty caused by Russia's war with Ukraine ripples through global financial markets. The economy likely contracted for a second consecutive quarter in the 3 months through September. Let's talk about this for the next few minutes. Gabriel Crouse, an analyst at the Institute of Race Relations in South Africa, joins me to discuss this further. Thank you so much for your time here, Crouse.
Thank you very much for having me.
Right. So why do economists think that South Africa is already in a technical recession?
So there are a couple of reasons. The first is that South Africa's economy grew at really a pathetic 1.7% in the first 3 months of this year. I say pathetic because of how much it fell during the COVID-19 pandemic. It should have grown by 5% to continue catching up, but it stopped growing, so it's flattened there. Then in the next 3 months, April, May, June, it shrank by 0.7%. So now the question is, what's it doing after that? Well, the trend is looking downwards. The lead indicators, the Purchasing Managers Index is the most reliable lead indicator. That's where economists go around and survey people on the coal face of action in business, people who are buying and selling, managing inventories and seeing how they're doing. That outlook is looking negative. Another reason is just looking at the basics that happened there. We had huge fuel price spikes at that period connected to the war in Ukraine. We also saw the worst floods in 50 years in KwaZulu-Natal, hugely exacerbated by government mismanagement of infrastructure, bridges that hadn't been maintained, washed away, hundreds of lives being lost, if not thousands. And the consequences of that have been, roughly 50 billion rand in insured claims already, the uninsured obviously in a much worse position. You add those together with, I think, maybe the biggest factor, which is this. South Africa's major exports continue to be minerals, raw commodities. And it's been a good time for those things. Like oil and gas has got more expensive. A lot of raw commodities have also gotten more expensive. So South Africa should be getting lots more money from that. And it has been getting a little bit more money. Unfortunately, the Mineral Council estimated that 50 billion rands worth of exports couldn't take place simply because the ports were clogged, the infrastructure broke, the railway. Sometimes the railway tracks in South Africa don't even exist during the pandemic.
So tell us how this is likely to affect the everyday South African.
It's very difficult. South Africa has the highest unemployment rate in the world on record already. Every time the economy contracts like this, the population is continuing to grow. It means unemployment is getting even greater, particularly amongst younger people. And I emphasize, because I was an unemployed young man myself for a time, amongst unemployed young men who tend towards the most dangerous social behavior when they don't have a good purpose in work. In terms of impact on cost of living, South Africa's inflation is not as bad as other places in the continent and the rest of the world, predominantly because of Recession, the governor of the Reserve Bank, who has had a very good sense of foresight and a disciplined policy. But inflation is still biting, and it's biting hard. We've seen the price of cooking oil double. We've seen the price of maize meal, the staple food of most South Africans, increase by 7%. To give you one last figure, it's estimated by the UN that I think it's right to say 3.7 million children in South Africa by 2025 are going to suffer from stunted growth as a result of not getting enough food, of being malnourished. It's an unacceptable state of affairs, but as long as the economy is not growing, it's difficult to see how that issue is going to get any better.
Indeed. How can the government avoid a full-blown recession at this point?
I mean, I think it's too late for this quarter. Those results are going to come out soon after, but we're playing through it. But I think going forward, the easiest thing for the government to do is cut the red tape, get out the way. We just saw last week one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the country said they're going to stop hiring staff of a particular race. It happens to be white. They won't hire anyone who's white because the government says they'll punish them with a 10% fine if they do. That is not a good way to run a company. It's not a good way to run a country. That kind of thing's got to go. The government's got to, it uses that red tape, according to Raymond Zondo, the Chief Justice of South Africa. He did this report into corruption. He says the problem is there's so much red tape in South Africa, it gets confusing. When it's confusing, the corruption creeps in because the government officials can eat the money and hide it behind all of the red tape, behind all of the confusion. So we need to cut the red tape to cut the corruption, and also to give businesses the opportunity to invest securely, knowing they're not going to be expropriated without compensation. They're not going to suffer a consequence like Zimbabwe. They can invest their money. They can build a new factory. There's going to be new jobs. And, I think we see lots of other countries in Africa. Every country has its problems. But if you look at Nigeria and Kenya, their gross fixed capital formation, that's the rate at which money is being put into building factories, hard job growing entities, is twice and 3 times as much as South Africa, respectively. And I think that's a clear indication that investors are looking at those countries and they're saying, I feel more safe to put my money here than South Africa. And I think that's because the South African government is sort of winning the prize at corruption, crony capitalism, and red tape. So it's got to cut that red tape to give investors a go, and then that's going to give people a chance to get a job.
Right. Gabriel, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us with your insights. Gabriel Crouse is an analyst with the Institute of Race Relations in South Africa. We have been talking the South African economy.